Deborah thought it was just another Friday night. The clink of silverware, the hum of conversation, the faint scent of expensive perfume lingering in the air. She moved through the restaurant like a shadow, unseen, unnoticed. Just another server in a sea of wealth. But tonight, everything would change. It started with a voice, sharp, mocking, cutting through the noise like a knife. "You think you belong here? Prove it." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to her. Deborah's heart raced, her hands trembling as she stood frozen, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. She glanced at the grand piano in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier's glow. It had been years since she'd touched one, years since she'd let herself dream. But now, the choice was hers. Walk away and fade back into the shadows, or step into the light and prove them all wrong. The air was thick with tension, the silence deafening. And then she moved. One step, then another, each one heavier than the last. The crowd watched, some smirking, others curious. But Deborah didn't see them. All she saw was the piano, waiting for her like an old friend. She sat down, her fingers hovering over the keys. For a moment, she hesitated. What if she failed? What if they laughed? But then, she remembered her mother's voice, soft and steady. "Music is your soul, baby. Let it speak." And so she began. The first note was shaky, the second barely audible. But with each stroke of the keys, the melody grew stronger, more confident. The room fell silent once more, but this time, it wasn't out of mockery, it was out of awe. What happened next? No one could have predicted, not even Deborah herself. Deborah's world was one of contrasts. By day, she lived in a small, dimly lit apartment on the outskirts of the city. The walls were bare, save for a faded poster of Nina Simone, a relic of a dream she'd long since buried. By night, she worked at La Rêve, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, where the air smelled of truffles and privilege, and the patrons barely noticed the woman refilling their glasses. Her days were a blur of routine, waking up before dawn, catching the bus to her shift, and returning home long after the city had fallen asleep. But beneath the monotony, there was a spark, a quiet, unyielding fire that refused to be extinguished. Music. It had always been her escape, her solace, her voice when words failed her. She'd grown up in a house filled with sound. Her mother, a jazz enthusiast, would play records late into the night, the soulful melodies weaving through the walls like a second heartbeat. Deborah had fallen in love with the piano at the age of 6, her small hands fumbling over the keys as she tried to mimic the songs her mother adored. By 12, she was playing at church, her fingers dancing across the keys with a confidence that belied her age. But the world wasn't kind to dreamers like her. "You're not the kind of girl people pay to see," her high school music teacher had said, his words sharp and final. And so, she'd packed away her dreams, tucking them into the corners of her mind like old photographs. At La Rêve, she was invisible. The patrons, wealthy, polished, and oblivious, saw only the uniform, not the person wearing it. But there were moments, fleeting and rare, when she allowed herself to imagine a different life. Moments when she'd catch a glimpse of the grand piano in the corner, its polished surface gleaming under the chandelier's light, and feel a pang of longing so sharp it took her breath away. Her best friend, Mia, was the only one who knew the truth. "You're too talented to be stuck here," Mia would say, her voice fierce with conviction. But Deborah would just shake her head, her smile tinged with sadness. "Talent doesn't pay the bills," she'd reply, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. And then there was her boss, Mr. Laurent, a man of few words and even fewer smiles. He ran La Rêve with an iron fist, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Deborah had always been wary of him, his cold demeanor a stark contrast to the warmth of the restaurant's ambience. But lately, she'd noticed something different, a flicker of something in his eyes when he looked at her. Respect? Curiosity? She couldn't be sure. Her family, too, was a constant presence in her life, though not always a comforting one. Her mother, now frail and ailing, still clung to the hope that Deborah would one day return to music. "You have a gift, baby," she'd say, her voice weak but unwavering. "Don't let the world take it from you." Her father, on the other hand, was practical to a fault. Dreams don't put food on the table, he'd grumble, his words a constant reminder of the life she was supposed to lead. But despite it all, Deborah couldn't quite let go. Late at night, when the world was quiet, she'd sit at the edge of her bed and hum the melodies that haunted her dreams. And sometimes, when no one was watching, she'd let her fingers dance across the tabletop, imagining the feel of the piano keys beneath her touch. It was a fragile existence, balanced on the edge of hope and resignation. But deep down, Deborah knew that something had to give. The spark inside her was too bright to be ignored, too fierce to be extinguished. And when the moment came, when Leonard Grayson's voice cut through the noise and challenged her to prove herself, she realized that this was her chance to step out of the shadows and into the light. But first, she had to face the music, literally. The night started like any other. The restaurant was alive with the hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, the soft murmur of jazz playing in the background. Deborah moved through the room with practiced ease, her tray balanced perfectly in one hand. She was invisible, as always, just another face in the crowd. But then, everything changed. It was Leonard Grayson who started it. He was a regular at La Rev, a man who wore his wealth like armor and his arrogance like a crown. That night, he was holding court at his usual table, surrounded by a group of equally polished, equally oblivious companions. Deborah had served them before, and she knew the drill. Keep your head down, your smile polite, and your opinions to yourself. But tonight, Leonard was in a mood. "You," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip. Deborah froze, her heart skipping a beat. He was looking straight at her, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I hear you know music." The room seemed to hold its breath. Deborah's hands tightened around the tray, her mind racing. How did he know? Who had told him? She glanced at Mia, who was standing by the bar, her face pale with shock. Well, Leonard's voice was louder now, demanding, "Prove it." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Deborah's stomach churned as every eye in the room turned toward her. She could feel their stares, curious, mocking, indifferent, pressing down on her like a weight. For a moment, she considered walking away. She could make an excuse, disappear into the kitchen, and pretend this never happened. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way Leonard was smirking, his confidence unshakable. Maybe it was the way the piano in the corner seemed to call to her, its polished surface gleaming under the chandelier's light. Or maybe it was the spark inside her, the one she'd tried so hard to ignore, flaring to life once more. She set the tray down on a nearby table, her hands trembling. The room was silent now, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Deborah took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest, and walked toward the piano. Each step felt like an eternity. She could hear the whispers starting, the murmurs of disbelief and curiosity. What is she doing? Someone asked. Does she even know how to play? Deborah ignored them. Her focus was on the piano, on the keys waiting for her like an old friend. She sat down, her fingers hovering over the ivory surface. For a moment, she hesitated. What if she failed? What if they laughed? But then, she remembered her mother's voice, soft and steady. Music is your soul, baby. Let it speak. And so she began. The first note was shaky, the second barely audible. The crowd began to murmur, and Leonard's smirk widened. But Deborah closed her eyes, blocking them out. She let the music guide her, her fingers moving with a life of their own. The melody started slow, tentative, like a bird testing its wings. But with each note, it grew stronger, more confident. The room fell silent once more, but this time, it wasn't out of mockery, it was out of awe. Leonard's smirk faded, replaced by something else. Surprise? Respect? Deborah couldn't tell, and she didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt alive. But as the final note hung in the air, trembling with emotion, she realized that this was only the beginning. The spark inside her had been reignited, and there was no going back. The problem wasn't just Leonard Grayson. It was the world he represented, a world that had tried to silence her, to make her small. And now she had a choice, to shrink back into the shadows or to step into the light and claim her place. The room erupted into applause, but Deborah barely heard it. Her eyes met Leonard's, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't expected: fear. The game had changed, and Deborah was ready to play. The applause faded, but the weight of the moment lingered. Deborah sat at the piano, her hands still trembling, her heart racing. The room was silent now, the air thick with tension. She had done it. She had proven herself. But as she looked around, she realized that this was only the beginning. Leonard Grayson's smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. He didn't say a word, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. Deborah stood, her legs unsteady, and made her way back to the kitchen. The crowd parted for her, their whispers following her like a shadow. "Deborah, that was incredible." Mia's voice was the first thing she heard as she pushed through the swinging doors. Her best friend was beaming, her eyes shining with pride. But Deborah couldn't bring herself to smile. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mia's smile faltered. "What do you mean? You were amazing. They loved you." Deborah shook her head, her mind racing. Leonard Grayson doesn't just let things go. He's not the type to forget a challenge or a humiliation. And she was right. The next few days were a blur. Leonard's table was conspicuously empty, but his presence loomed over the restaurant like a storm cloud. Deborah tried to go about her work as usual, but the tension was palpable. The other servers avoided her, their whispers sharp and judgmental. Even Mr. Laurent seemed distant, his usual stern demeanor replaced by something darker, more calculating. Then the rumors started. "Did you hear? Leonard's planning to buy the restaurant," one of the servers whispered, her voice low and urgent. "He's got it out for Deborah. Says she's a liability." Deborah's heart sank. She had known this would happen, but hearing it out loud made it real. She tried to push the fear aside, to focus on her work, but it was impossible. Every time the door opened, she flinched, half expecting Leonard to walk in and deliver the final blow. But it wasn't Leonard who came for her. It was Mr. Laurent. "Deborah," he said one evening, his voice cold and clipped. "My office." Now, her stomach churned as she followed him, her mind racing with possibilities. Was she being fired? Had Leonard already made his move? The office was small and dimly lit, the walls lined with shelves of dusty wine bottles. Mr. Laurent sat behind his desk, his hands steepled in front of him. For a long moment, he said nothing, his sharp eyes studying her like a specimen under glass. "You've caused quite a stir," he said finally, his voice devoid of emotion. Deborah swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter what you meant," he interrupted. "What matters is the result. Leonard Grayson is one of our most important clients. And now, thanks to you, he's threatening to pull his business." Deborah's heart sank. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. Mr. Laurent leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Sorry doesn't fix this, but maybe there's a way to turn it around." Deborah frowned. "What do you mean?" "Leonard's hosting a charity gala next week," he said. "He's asked for you to perform." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Perform? For him?" Mr. Laurent nodded. "It's a chance to smooth things over, to prove that you're an asset, not a liability." Deborah's mind raced. The thought of performing for Leonard, of playing for a room full of people who saw her as nothing more than a spectacle, made her stomach churn. But what choice did she have? "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Laurent nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good. Don't let me down." The days that followed were a blur of preparation and panic. Deborah practiced relentlessly, her fingers aching from hours at the piano. But no matter how much she played, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her like a second skin. The night of the gala arrived, and with it a storm. The rain poured down in sheets, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Deborah stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was filled with the city's elite, their laughter and chatter echoing off the high ceilings. Leonard was at the center of it all, his presence commanding as always. He caught her eye and smirked, raising his glass in a silent toast. Deborah's stomach churned, but she forced herself to smile. The performance was a disaster. Her fingers fumbled over the keys, the notes coming out shaky and uneven. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their disappointment palpable. Leonard's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Deborah's heart sank. She had failed, but as she stood to leave, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let him win. Not again. She sat back down, her hand steady now, her mind clear. And then she began to play. The melody started slow, tentative, but with each note, it grew stronger, more confident. The room fell silent, the crowd's murmurs fading into nothing. Deborah closed her eyes, letting the music guide her, letting it speak for her. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. But Deborah didn't stay to bask in it. She stood, her head held high, and walked out of the ballroom, the storm raging around her. The struggle wasn't over, but for the first time, Deborah felt like she had a fighting chance. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within Deborah. Rain lashed against the windows of her tiny apartment, the wind howling like a wounded animal. She sat at the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing. The gala had been a turning point, but not the one she'd hoped for. Leonard Grayson's smirk haunted her, his words echoing in her mind like a cruel taunt. "You're a liability," he'd said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You don't belong here." But the worst part was that part of her believed him. She glanced at the piano in the corner of her apartment, its surface dusty from neglect. It had been weeks since she'd played, the memory of her failure at the gala too painful to bear. The spark that had once burned so brightly inside her felt like a distant memory, smothered by doubt and fear. But then the phone rang. It was Mia. "Deborah, you need to see this," her best friend said, her voice urgent. "See what?" Deborah asked, her heart skipping a beat. "Just turn on the news." Deborah's hands trembled as she reached for the remote. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, her name, plastered across the bottom of the screen in bold letters. "Local pianist stuns at charity gala." The footage showed her performance, the shaky start, the moment of hesitation, and then the transformation. The camera had captured it all. The way her fingers moved across the keys, the way the crowd fell silent, the way the music seemed to fill the room with light. Deborah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't failed. Not really. But the relief was short-lived. The next segment was an interview with Leonard Grayson. He sat in his usual smug pose, his smile sharp and calculating. "Deborah is a talented musician," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But talent isn't enough. She lacks the discipline, the drive to succeed in this industry." The words cut deep, but they also ignited something inside her, a spark of defiance, of determination. She wasn't going to let him win. The next morning, Deborah walked into La Rev with her head held high. The whispers followed her as always, but this time, she ignored them. She had a plan. Mr. Laurent was in his office, his expression unreadable as she walked in. "Deborah," he said, his voice cool. "What can I do for you?" "I want to perform," she said, her voice steady. "Not just here. Everywhere." Mr. Laurent raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to do that?" Deborah took a deep breath. "I'm going to enter the international music competition." The room fell silent. The competition was one of the most prestigious in the world, a launching pad for careers. But it was also fiercely competitive, with thousands of applicants from around the globe. Mr. Laurent studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but if you're going to do this, you're going to do it right. No more half measures. No more excuses." Deborah nodded, her heart pounding. "I understand." The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation. Deborah practiced relentlessly, her fingers aching from hours at the piano. She poured her heart into every note, every melody, every chord. The spark inside her grew brighter with each passing day, fueled by determination and defiance. But the road wasn't easy. Leonard Grayson wasn't about to let her forget her place. He showed up at La Rev more often, his presence a constant reminder of the stakes. He would sit at his usual table, his eyes following her like a predator stalking its prey. "You're wasting your time," he said one evening, his voice cold and cutting. "You'll never make it." Deborah didn't respond. She couldn't. But his words lingered, a shadow in the back of her mind. The day of the competition arrived, and with it, a storm of emotions. Deborah stood backstage, her hands trembling, her heart racing. The other competitors were a blur of nerves and talent, each one more intimidating than the last. But Deborah wasn't here to compete with them. She was here to prove something to herself. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage with her head held high. The spotlight was blinding, the silence deafening. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But then, she remembered her mother's voice, soft and steady. "Music is your soul, baby. Let it speak." And so she began. The melody started slow, tentative, like a bird testing its wings. But with each note, it grew stronger, more confident. The music filled the room, weaving a story of struggle, of defiance, of hope. Deborah closed her eyes, letting the music guide her, letting it speak for her. The world faded away, leaving only the piano and the melody. When she finished, the room was silent. For a moment, she thought she had failed. But then the applause began, slow at first, then building into a thunderous roar. Deborah stood, her heart pounding, her eyes searching the crowd. And then she saw him. Leonard Grayson stood at the back of the room, his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, and Deborah saw something she hadn't expected: respect. The decision had been made. The spark inside her had become a flame, and there was no going back. The game had changed, and Deborah was ready to play. The applause was deafening, a roaring wave of sound that seemed to lift Deborah off her feet. She stood on the stage, her heart pounding, her hands trembling at her sides. The spotlight was blinding, but she didn't need to see the crowd to feel their energy, their awe, their admiration, their respect. For the first time in her life, Deborah felt seen. But the moment was fleeting. As the applause died down and the reality of what she'd just accomplished began to sink in, her mind raced. What now? What came next? The answer came sooner than she expected. Backstage, the chaos was overwhelming. Reporters clamored for interviews, photographers snapped pictures, and fellow competitors offered their congratulations. Deborah moved through it all in a daze, her mind still replaying the performance. And then she saw him. Leonard Grayson stood at the edge of the room, his presence commanding as always. But something was different. The smirk was gone, replaced by an expression she couldn't quite read. Respect? Awe? Regret? He approached her slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Deborah," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. That was extraordinary. She didn't know what to say. The man who had once tried to crush her spirit was now standing before her, his words filled with genuine admiration. It was surreal, almost too much to process. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Leonard nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned and walked away. Deborah watched him go, a strange sense of closure settling over her. The chapter with Leonard was over, but her story was just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of opportunities. Record labels reached out, offering contracts. Event organizers called, begging her to perform. Even Mr. Laurent, ever the pragmatist, offered her a permanent spot at La Rêve, no longer as a server, but as the featured performer. But Deborah knew she couldn't stay. She sat in her tiny apartment one evening, the city lights twinkling outside her window. The piano in the corner seemed to call to her, its polished surface gleaming in the dim light. She walked over and sat down, her fingers brushing the keys. The melody that came out was soft, tentative, but filled with hope. It was a song of new beginnings, of dreams realized and battles won. As she played, she thought of her mother, of the sacrifices she'd made, of the words that had carried her through the darkest moments. "Music is your soul, baby. Let it speak." And so she did. Deborah's first album debuted at the top of the charts, a stunning collection of original compositions that told her story in every note. Critics raved, fans adored, and the world finally saw her for who she was. Not just a talented musician, but a force to be reckoned with. But success didn't change her. If anything, It made her more determined. She used her platform to lift others, to give voice to those who had been silenced. She started a foundation to support aspiring musicians from underserved communities, ensuring that no one would have to face the same obstacles she had. And through it all, she never forgot where she came from. One evening, she returned to La Rev, not as a server or a performer, but as a guest. The restaurant was as elegant as ever, the air filled with the scent of fine wine and gourmet food. She sat at a table near the piano, her eyes lingering on the instrument that had started it all. Mia joined her, her smile as bright as ever. "Look at you," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You did it." Deborah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you." The two friends sat in comfortable silence, the bond between them stronger than ever. And as the evening wore on, Deborah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, of heartbreak. But through it all, she had held onto the spark inside her, the spark that had become a flame, and then a fire. As she left the restaurant that night, the city lights twinkling like stars, Deborah knew that this was only the beginning. The world was hers for the taking, and she was ready to claim it. But for now, she was content to simply be, to breathe, to dream, to live. And as she walked into the night, her head held high and her heart full, she knew one thing for certain. She had proven them all wrong.